Hello there, I'm Peter Mansbridge in Vancouver, here today with a program we hope you're going to find engaging and informative. We're here to talk about some of the same things the country's leaders were talking about this week: climate change, pipelines, and Indigenous issues. Our audience will set the tone for all this with their questions. They're mostly students from both the University of British Columbia, UBC, and the BC Institute of Technology, BCIT. And here to answer them, the folks from At Issue, our regulars, Post-Media columnist Andrew Coyne and the National Affairs columnist of the Toronto Star, Chantal. Joining them for this special broadcast, Shachi Kurl, Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute here in Vancouver, and Hayden King, Director of the Centre of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University in Toronto. So, enough with the intros. Let's get started with the first question, and it's right here.
Hi, I'm Andrei Sobolewski. I think I'm the senior citizen in this group here. I was...
Not quite.
I was thinking how Prime Minister Trudeau could compel recalcitrant provinces from joining a national plan. And then I thought, is a national plan actually necessary? Could each of the provinces tackle climate change with their own plan?
All right, well, we've certainly heard enough different plans from different areas on this. Shachi, first of all?
Well, to that point, I mean, BC is standing up and saying, we've got our plan, thank you very much. Ontario and Quebec, we have our plan. Premier of Nova Scotia is saying, well, we're investing in hydroelectric, we're good. So you have very strong regional identification and regional plans coming up, and that can be used to sort of foment a sort of provincial resistance to the idea of a unilateral plan that we're hearing bandied about at this meeting with the Prime Minister, and those were the noises being made most recently. I think it's going to be difficult and dangerous because, again, you have plans underway, and really does this Prime Minister want to risk doing what his father did in terms of a national energy plan and really going in that direction? So I think it could be challenging if, at minimum, he's got to bring not just the provinces on side, but don't forget that there are some really big urban-rural splits going on in terms of opinion as well.
All right, Chantal first.
You don't need to have either or. The federal government comes down on every province, one size fits all. I think the goal of the federal government is to set a floor price on carbon, and then which will not be as high as what BC is already doing. They're not meaning to tell BC, stop doing what you're doing and come down to our level, but to force those who are not doing anything to actually raise their gains. And the carrot, it's not just the stick. The carrot is that if you do it provincially, you get to keep the revenues provincially. If the federal government does it because you do not have something in place, the revenues go to Ottawa. Where the strains come are in provinces like Saskatchewan, where the economy is poor, the resources industry is in trouble, and the Premier is philosophically opposed to the notion.
Andrew?
I think certainly politically you have to, whatever you do, the revenues have to stay in the province. I agree with that point. But I do worry that we're going to get 13 different plans with 13 different set of exemptions, 13 different prices if they do put a price on it. I mean, this is not a problem that stops at provincial boundaries or even national boundaries. It's a global problem. And the idea that we're going to have the provinces, you know, tailoring the thing to favor particular industries, et cetera, I just think we're looking to add more and more complexity and cost to business that aren't really needed.
This is the issue of whether or not they're creating a checkerboard Canada where everybody will have a different set of principles, but is the end game still the same? I mean, if they are all different principles, but you're ending up at the same place, what difference does it make?
It doesn't. I mean, there's room for experimentation, there's room for differences. I'm just saying the more in which, as I say, if Ontario has a cap and trade plan, so that's one set of rules and regulations and exemptions that business have to deal with, then they go across the border to Manitoba and they have a whole different set of rules, regulations, prices, exceptions. It's just adding needless complexity that I think is going to imperil the whole project.
All right, next question.
Hi, my name is Alex Hemingway. I'm a PhD student at UBC. We know from the climate science that 80% of fossil fuel reserves, including in Canada, need to stay in the ground if we're going to take my generation's future on this planet seriously. Do the actions of our leaders reflect that reality and urgency?
Yeah, Shachi.
Well, the leaders are dealing with three big mindsets when it comes to climate change. People fall into one of three big buckets. They are either true believers. These are younger Canadians. For them, climate change and environmental issues are moral issues. It's worse to drive an SUV than it is to look at porn on the internet. I mean, these are very passionate people about these issues. They tend to be younger, they tend to be urban, and they are a big part of the cohort that actually grew the voting pie in this last election and gave Justin Trudeau his majority mandate. Then you've got the skeptics. Older, they tend to be men, tend to be living in Alberta on the prairies, and they're not necessarily skeptical about the causes of climate change, although some of them are complete deniers and doubters, but others are just sort of saying that they're skeptical about whether or not doing anything when you're looking at a much bigger, more global issue is actually going to have an impact. That's where some of the skepticism exists as well. And then you've got everyone else in the middle. And for them, this is transcending public policy issues and more really about watching what's happening outside the window, the hottest year on record, the craziest winters on record, and really saying, okay, this is real, this is happening. These folks are open to persuasion, but there really is a need to square the circle for them around their concerns around the economy. So those are the folks that these leaders have to talk to and bring on side, especially that persuadable group.
Hayden, we've been watching the political leaders of various stripes over the last few years, and we've watched them again this week. Did their actions reflect the urgency that at least part of those Canadians that Shachi was just talking about, did they reflect that urgency?
I don't think so. And I mean, I would say absolutely not. I don't think that premiers or the Prime Minister are taking climate change seriously at all. Justin Trudeau said the path to a greener future is by building oil pipelines. We're going to finance our new green infrastructure through oil pipelines. That is just nonsensical, and in fact, I think that it's misleading. If we're going to keep 80% of the oil in the ground, we're not going to mitigate burning carbon and putting emissions into the air by building pipelines. And that the premiers are unwilling to commit to any carbon pricing because they're concerned about their fragile economies. Saskatchewan, British Columbia, the territories, Nunavut, they're concerned that that's going to affect their economies. Well, I'll tell you what will affect economies when climate change hits us, and there is no economy.
Some would argue it's already hitting us.
Sure, of course it is, yeah.
Right? Chantal, you wanted in on that?
Except that some is already staying in the ground, in Saskatchewan in particular, and what determines that is market forces, frankly. And market forces will determine whether more of it stays in the ground. We can leave it all in the ground and it will not change the global economy from fossil fuel to something else. So the solution isn't necessarily in one jurisdiction saying we're going to keep our fossil fuel in the ground and let someone else fill that gap. It's in changing the global economy, because this is not an issue on which Canada has a huge impact, to tell you the truth.
All right, next question.
Hi, my name is Radhika Sigikane. I'm a student at BCIT. My question is, if Canada is going to focus in investing in renewable energy resources, is there any indication that our government is really preparing for a shift away from our dependence on oil and pipelines?
Andrew?
Well, I'm not sure that we should, I think we want to be careful not overstating the shift that's required. People talk about us being dependent on energy, or they talk about putting all our eggs in one basket, this kind of thing. Energy is about 6 or 7% of GDP. If you define it really broadly, you can maybe get it up to 10%. So the amount of shifting that's going on, that needs to go on, first of all, can be overstated. I certainly wouldn't want it to be led by government. When people are investing government funds in particular projects, typically they're subsidizing things that people would have done anyway, or they're subsidizing things that they wouldn't have done because they made no earthly sense, or they're only, at the best of cases, doing a small sliver of the possible things that we could be doing. I think I'm much more of the view that says you put a price on carbon, you immediately give the incentive for everybody to be thinking about ways either to economize on their use of carbon or to invest in other non-renewable resources. To me, that's the necessary and sufficient approach to it.
All right, next question.
I'd like to know what's the most important national level contribution to Indigenous reconciliation?
Hayden.
It's a difficult question. Indigenous peoples across Canada are very diverse. Needs, interests, concerns are all much different. Treaty areas, non-treaty areas, rural, reserve. But I think that, and many people have said this before me, but there can really be no reconciliation without restitution. Canada is founded on the dispossession of Indigenous peoples' territories, so reconciliation really, for me, and I think many others, means returning a lot of that land and returning a lot of that those resources. That's a tall order, of course, for Canadians, but really, if we're being serious about reconciliation, I think that's what's required. Right now, there seems to be a momentum towards this concept of free, prior, and informed consent, allowing Indigenous people to determine what happens in their territory, which I think would go a long way towards mitigating climate change, to be honest. So if we institutionalize that, maybe even, and again, another tall order, put that in our Constitution, that would allow Indigenous peoples to have more jurisdiction over their territories, and maybe move us away from the Indian Act, which of course is required. So I think that that's kind of the foundation. There's many, many things that we have to address if we're serious about reconciliation, but I think that's where I would start.
Chantal, you were nodding in agreement on that?
But I was also thinking that if you think it's hard to get the premiers to agree to a carbon tax, which is a fairly straightforward notion, imagine the situation of the provinces versus the First Nations and the Aboriginal people on the territory are as diverse as the First Nations. And so how this would be handled, Quebec has some experience on that with La Paix des Braves. A lot of work was done on that front, but it's a complex issue. And it's going to require a level of political engagement that most governments do not have at the federal level. And one of the reasons for that is that in the end, it's not a ballot box issue for most Canadians.
It's interesting, though, that we come off the heels of the carbon tax discussion onto this, and we realize that even, you know, in both these issues, we're talking about what a big country we are and how there are so many diverse feelings and opinions and ways to deal with certain issues. And I guess you see this, Shachi, all the time in your research, the differences of opinion through the different regions of the country.
Very much so. So when Chantal was talking earlier about sort of where BC is at on an issue and where Quebec is at on an issue, there can be a mindset that because some of the loudest voices come from British Columbia or come from, you know, the Montreal area on a particular point, that means that the entire province thinks that way. And I always like to remind people across the country sitting here in Vancouver that, in fact, when it comes to things like the Enbridge pipeline to Northern Gateway, you know, British Columbians are actually fairly split on this issue depending on what part of the province they live in. That isn't always the point of view or the voice that makes it across this vast country of ours, but it is an important one to remember, and it's, again, like you say, it's very complex.
We've got to take a break, but we have more questions, so please stay with us. Next question.
My name is Nathan. I'm a student at BCIT. It seems that this Liberal government is committed to deficit spending. Do you feel this is prudent in light of the export and energy nature of our economy?
No,
Right. Chantal.
let him answer. I am not an economist, and Andrew can walk you through the theory, but I think that it's, in this instance, probably appropriate to favor spending, and I'm waiting to see what the spending is, over balancing the books at this point. And there is a case that is being made that stimulus would be in order. Most provinces don't have that option, and they are tightening their belts. Now, it is also a fact, and I put some credence in that Mr. Trudeau did tell Canadians that he would do that. In sharp contrast with the usual, oh, I just looked at the books and I discovered there's a hole, so forget my promises because I'm going to have to spend more than I'm actually taking in. That's what Mr. Mulcair would have been forced to do. So I'm willing to give them a pass on this course for now.
All right. Hold on, Andrew.
I know. Any other word, he's going to jump out.
I mean, Chantal's right. The Liberals promised there would be deficit spending over the term of their office. They also promised they'd get it back to balance books by the end of it, but that seems to be gone now, and even the original promise of $10 billion a year, it's going to be much more than that. But before Andrew gives us his feelings, Shachi, just where are Canadians on this issue of deficit?
This was, to me, one of the defining moments of the election campaign, where we put the face-off directly to Canadians. Should we balance the books, even if that means trading off some social program spending? Or should we spend in order to look at creating economic stimulus, creating jobs, that kind of thing? And overwhelmingly, at this point, Canadians are on side with deficits. But even though there is a green light to this, there are speed limits. It's not just go have at her. Right now, you've got about a third of Canadians who still say we shouldn't be running deficits at all, full stop. You've got about half saying, look, we're okay with deficits, but stick to that $10 billion that you promised, because that's what you promised. That leaves the Prime Minister with really only about 1 in 5 Canadians, about 20%, saying, sure, go have at her, do what you need to do. And that's not exactly the majority. So the pressure now is to deliver and to be able to meaningfully show that this has been a worthwhile process.
All right, Andrew.
Well, I'm skeptical of how much good it'll do, needless to say. It's not going to be the end of the world if we run a $30 billion deficit 1 or 2 years. I guess the worry is that you start building up clientele that expect that spending, and it becomes very hard at some point to rein that spending in if you need to. And the longer you're running those deficits year after year, the more the debt builds up, the more you're exposed to the risk of what happens if we go into a recession, what happens if interest rates spike, or what have you. I guess with this government, I wonder what is their bottom line. We blew through the $10 billion cap. We blew through the we're going to balance the budget in 4 years cap. We've now blown through the we're going to keep the debt to GDP ratio going down. So is there any budget constraint? And if so, what is it? I think it's going to be one of the questions we're going to have to answer in the budget.
But to flip your question, I guess you should also ask yourself, what happens if we don't? What would the impact be of balancing the books at all costs? What programs would be affected? How much would transfer payments to the provinces and hence their bottom lines be affected? Public services. So it's not a theoretical discussion in the sense that if you're going to say we must balance the books, there will be consequences for real people too. So
to be clear,
it's a choice between, you know, there's no totally right answer to this.
To be clear, I'm not saying they should balance the budget in year 1. I'm just wondering, do we need to add another $30 billion on top of the already deficit we're going to be running into?
Here's the last question. I'd like to get each of your thoughts on it, but they're going to have to be brief thoughts if we're going to make this in time. It comes from Curtis Rowland. It's an email question from Vancouver right here. Do you think politics are becoming increasingly divisive? And if so, what does that mean for the unattached, non-partisan voter?
I think
Chantal.
there are more and more unattached, non-partisan voters, and on that basis, I don't buy the notion that they are becoming more polarized. In the old days, when my parents were discussing politics, people who always voted Conservative would bang the table against people who always voted Red. The discussions now are about issues. My kids disagree with me on Bombardier. I think most of the time they're to the left of me. But on this one, they're to the right of me. And I think that's a better conversation, but it also doesn't speak to polarization.
Shachi.
I think voters are actually this time around a little bit more unified than they have been in a long time. So whether that's polarization or just stratification, the politics of the Stephen Harper years were all about find the wedges, exploit them where they exist, create them if you have to. And that was how the political math worked for the Conservatives for a decade. This time, Justin Trudeau sort of managed to wrap everyone in the flag and really speak to and work the political symbols of this country in a way that brought people together. Will it last? That's the question.
Hayden.
Sometimes it's difficult for me to distinguish between political parties that we have in Canada. So I'm not necessarily sure it's partisan division that we see, but I would agree with Chantal that there are issues that are dividing Canadians. Climate is obviously one, race, gender, class. I think these are the divisions that we're seeing in society, and I don't think the parties are able to adequately address them. So for the nonpartisan voter out there, maybe there are alternate avenues for political action beyond the ballot box.
We're about to embark on a very interesting discussion as a country on the nature of our electoral system and whether we should change from the one we've had, the first past the post system, to some form of proportional representation or other model. And I think that's going to be one of the issues that we're going to be considering, is the degree to which the old model has encouraged divisiveness and polarization, and to the degree to which another model might encourage a more collaborative, less confrontational type of politics. I think that's a good discussion to have.
Well, you can catch the extended 1-hour edition of At Issue in Vancouver this weekend. There'll be lots more questions from the students, plus some of your questions. That's on CBC News Network Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern.